Okay, so welcome to the latest edition of the Reset Show, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the brilliant Michelle Parry-Slater today. So a bit of background about Michelle. I first worked with Michelle over last year, really, when she was at the CIPD on a program we developed for CIPD. More of that later. But Michelle is an award-winning L&D professional. She's got over 20 years experience in the industry. She's the founder and director of Kairos Modern Learning. Michelle, tell me if I pronounced that right or not in a minute, which is an L&D consultancy specializing in driving a shift from traditional courses, the best of digital, social and face-to-face workplace learning, which I think is music to all of our ears. She's worked with CIPD, as I mentioned, Co-op, Duke of Edinburgh Award. She was the lead volunteer for L&D for Girl Guiding and was listed as one of the top 20 corporate e-learning movers and shakers a few years ago as well by the e-learning industry. And Michelle also has a fantastic book that we're going to talk about today out on Kogan Page called the Learning and Development Handbook. I want to get that right. Came out in 2021, so another lockdown book baby, and it's a really, really practical book for anybody in the world of L&D. Really, it's about how to develop effective and engaging workplace learning that improves performance, productivity, and the organization's bottom line. So really good book. We're going to find out more about that in just a minute. But Michelle, anything that I've not mentioned in my intro that we need to know about you?
Okay, well, welcome. Thank you for having me on. I am no longer the lead volunteer for Girl Guiding. So at Girl Guiding, our voluntary jobs are taken for a period of time and then we hand them to the next person, but we don't run away. So I am actually the specialist volunteer for the learning platform, which we've very happily, pleased to say, we launched in January this year. So it's been a project that I've worked on as lead volunteer and alongside the rest of the team of staff and volunteers, and finally super excited to get that project out there. So we're monitoring at the moment how it's landing and of course what the experience is for people on that platform, because we were all about trying to offer learning to our volunteers in a multitude of ways. So not just face-to-face, but adding to digital, and we've done webinar and now we're onto platform. So yeah, probably don't know that about me too.
Oh, great. Really interesting. Okay. We also need to know that you've got lots of dogs as well, haven't you? You love the dogs.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a dog obsessed person. Yes, that is true. But you'll be glad to know, Emma, they're all around my mum's at the moment, bar one. So you might hear one woof, but the two puppies who would end up squabbling are not here. So I can't even show you them on the screen.
No, all good, all good. So thinking about let's go back to the book then. As I said, the book was published in 2021, so I guess you're writing it over lockdown.
No, it's not a lockdown baby book, actually.
Yeah.
So I started writing this book in 2019, before we even knew about Corona. So I'd written the majority of it before we went into lockdown, but unfortunately the publishers went on furlough. So it ended up being a lockdown published book. So sometimes you might be reading through it thinking, well, that might have changed, but I've got my eye on edition 2, you see.
Yes.
Second edition eye on. But some of the things, obviously, I was still writing, and there's a bit more of an influence of COVID, but it has, COVID as a pandemic has totally changed the way we approach L&D. So definitely need to do a little bit of updating. But that's not to say the book's out of date, because the book is not about, how we do L&D today. It's more about how you learn more about your context of learning and development, and it stages you through a process of thinking. From previous thinking was around, let's put on a course, let's get out there and do something, let's find a solution. But actually the book is staged through the chapters to say, really find out what the problem is that you're trying to solve, really understand the audience and what the experience you want them to have is. And it gathers you through sort of stakeholders, consultancy and so on and so forth to finally get to the solution. Whereas what we tended to do in the old days of L&D is jump to the solution as soon as we were asked for it. And that's why we can't necessarily prove our value very well. It's why we don't always provide a solution that really lands for people, because we perhaps don't know our audience enough. Those sorts of things are in the book. And so not a lockdown baby, but certainly useful in this post-pandemic world.
Absolutely. So how did the book come about, Michelle?
Well, I kind of wrote it for me, and I know that sounds weird, but years ago when I started out in learning and development, I was a sole practitioner in an organisation, and so many of us in learning and development we might sit with HR, we might sit with the people experience team, we might sit in different departments, but often there's one of us, or there's a couple. Who do you bounce your ideas off? Who do you get your inspiration from? Those sorts of things. Now, I turned to Twitter. And had a huge network build up on Twitter because I found that a really useful space for me. Also turned to Don Taylor's Learning and Skills group and the webinars there, which are really useful still even now, and we're talking well over a decade later. So I wanted there to be a book for people like me, that practitioner in post who wanted to be able to sort of dip into something easily, to be able to say, what could the freshest thinking on that? What ideas could I try about this? And so I wrote it for the sole practitioner. What's also, of course, in my mind is sometimes we've got responsibility for L&D when we're a line manager or when we're a HR generalist. And so there's huge use cases for the book in those circumstances as well, because as a line manager, if you are into people development, you've got so many other things on your mind, so many other task orientated things, as well as the people development side of things, that making a book which is really easily accessible was super important to me, so that everyone who uses it and reads it can dip in and out as they need to.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it really comes across that you absolutely know your audience, your readers, when I read it, because it's so easy to read, and that's a real compliment, because I think a lot of books aren't, and so you kind of end up putting them down and don't ever come back to them. And what I love about your book is really practical. And you mentioned actually about Twitter, and you are very prolific on Twitter, and you post lots of really super helpful stuff. So just for our listeners, what's your Twitter handle if they want to follow you?
It's at MIPS1608, MIPS, my initials, 1608, my birthday. Please do send in the birthday cards. And so that's how you find me on most platforms, or just by my name. I'm quite fortunate that there's not a lot of Michelle Parry-Slaters out there.
No, definitely not. So I think, just going back to kind of, I guess, the premise of the book, one of the fundamental ideas you talk about is this need to shift to a more modern workplace learning approach, which I think sounds really exciting. So can you tell us more about that, what you mean by that, and what's the idea behind that?
Okay, so the idea is largely that we need to shift away from being reactive. And by reactive, I mean, as I said earlier, somebody comes to us and says, Bob wants to go on a course, and we go, yes, we have this course or that course or the other course. Now, I think in truth, I think we have already started to make that shift. It isn't a very usual learning and development department that only offers the course solution. But we're still not there to a full suite of, okay, well, why does Bob need to go on a course? Okay, we identify why Bob needs to go on a course. That becomes part of our measure. How do we know that we're going to have done anything to shift Bob's thinking and behaviour and skills? We know where he is at the beginning, or she, and we then can put an intervention in place that's more suited to that individual. Now, the challenge with that is, when we're talking about this personalisation of a learning experience, is that, can we do that for everybody across a huge organisation? Somebody's listening thinking, well, Michelle, I've got 54,000 people in my organisation. How on earth can I offer an individual route? So my view is, and there's a diagram of this in the book, is that we can offer the formal boxes. We can offer, a course, or maybe it's an online event, or maybe it's a conference that somebody would go to. We can offer those, but it's how we wrap that in two other layers. Now, one of those layers is a suite of different resources for people to call upon when they need it. So we're not offering just in case learning through the formal route. We're also offering just in time learning. So something I need to pull on, maybe it's a TED talk to inspire me before I go and do a really important sales pitch, for example. The second layer that's wrapped around all of that is community. So knowing that we've got people I can talk to, people I can go to. So that community may be as simple as, here is a list of all the people in our organisation and their specialist skills. If you've got a problem with pivot tables in Excel, speak to Agnes, who works in finance, and that's the resource that L&D might be providing. That's a limited community. Ideally, you would have more of a community which is a place to ask questions in the moment, get real-time instant messages, that kind of thing. And if we think about other aspects of our lives, we do start with the community. So if you're interested in cycling, you'll be hanging out with other cyclists. You know, if you're interested in music, Emma, like I know you are, you know where the musos hang out, and that's where you get your inspiration, your literal muse. So wrapping stuff in community is the sort of almost secret sauce, really, that people can get the best answer. What happens if you don't do that is what's happened forever. You ask the person sitting next to you. Now, obviously, while we're all working virtually, you ask the people that you know, and that even more limits our community, because you're not physically sitting next to somebody. You may only know a few people in your organisation that you feel comfortable, you know, getting on a Teams call with. And so our pool of knowledge is shrinking from where we're fishing. And so L&D needs to take a proactive stance, I think, in order to support us with you know, a more modern approach, which is more around what do people need in the moment in order to do their job, to be an unblocker.
Yeah, no, I love that, because like you say, outside of work, you know, we use communities all the time, don't we, for whatever it is we need help with. And recommendations, anyone know someone that, you know, at the moment I'm asking recommendations of people that are for driving instructors that are super patient for my ASPE 17-year-old, you know, and it's we wouldn't think twice about that, but as you say, inside organizations it's not as easy to do that, is it? So I love that. Something that you talk about that I think will be maybe controversial, I don't think it's controversial, but some might think it's controversial, is you talk about face-to-face learning being no longer fit for purpose. So can you talk to us about why you think that, and what we need to do about this?
Face-to-face learning's not been fit for purpose for a very long time. And if we think about where it came from, when we were moving from field to factory, we needed people to have some specific skills. And similarly, in a post-war environment where we set up a lot of new type of businesses, and we needed people to have specific skills. And at those times, we were very limited on resource. So we may have had, you know, one book, one teacher, one expert, so, you know, one person who could share with others. And so it made sense in those settings. But now, you know, we'll carry, not all, but a lot of us carry a mobile phone in our pocket where we can get any information that we need at any time. So why would we wait for a face-to-face setting, you know, a course, something that's going to happen in 3 months' time? We need to know today. The world is so impatient, and, you know, I think quite rightly so, because that's what keeps us moving, and the speed of change is such that if we don't keep up, we're going to be way left behind. And when you think about just even 10 years ago, I had in my company, when I was working in a global organization, I had a desktop computer and I had a BlackBerry. Okay, but actually in my house, I had a laptop and a smartphone. I was better equipped at home to find things I needed to find, to work where I needed to work, to do what I needed to do, than I was in my workplace. Now, thankfully, we're not there now. People generally have got a smartphone and a laptop in their workplace settings. And yet we're still expecting them to go to a hotel with strip lit lights and a boxed room to be inspired for learning. That doesn't work. This is just not how we live our lives. So I do want to be clear. I don't think we should throw face-to-face out. I think it's hugely valuable, but it's what we do there in that space that's important. So considering when you used to go, you know, maybe a week-long program and you'd stay overnight in the hotel, and the good stuff there was not necessarily what happened from 9 to 5. It was what happened from 5 till 10 in the evening. It was the, you know, or the coffee breaks or the lunch breaks, and that networking, that making connections, that human to human interaction, that learning from others, all of that hugely valuable.
Right.
My proposition is that we do that. We call it networking, we call it sense making, we flip the classroom so that the knowledge stuff happens when people need it, but the sense making happens in the moment, in that face-to-face environment.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was reading some, I think it might have been maybe Linda Grattan or somebody talking in Harvard Business Review about hybrid working, and you know, hybrid, people are very much focused on location, haven't they? And it's obviously, we know it's much more location. It's about the time, it's about job craft, all those wonderful things, but just something really simple. An office designer was saying how we kind of need to flip the design. So previously, to open plan for work we do on our own, our desk or our laptop, and then meeting rooms behind closed doors for the sense making bit. Saying let's flip that. It's like that is so obvious, as most great ideas are, that we should be having the open plan bit for all the, the kind of the meetings, the sense making, the collaboration, that part of our work, and the bit we need to kind of focus, we should be locked away for. It's obvious, but I just never thought
now you say it out loud, I'm like, absolutely. I talk about make better cake. Okay, so how do you get people involved? How do you get people enthusiastic for your ideas? How do you encourage people to try new stuff? Make better cake. If you create something that's exciting, that's good, that works, that shows value, and of course in my context I'm talking about a new learning program or whatever, an experience of learning that's different from before, people want to have some of that. People want to come along, go, I heard there was great cake, where's the cake? What you've just described is exactly that. If you imagine that energy is in an open plan space, where you're creating, I don't know, your next 5-year strategy for your organization, how wonderful it would be to be wandering around there making coffee and hearing what they're talking about. That energy would be just so lifting. That's it. I'm never having a closed meeting ever again.
No. And actually, a few years ago, we were lucky enough to work with Lush, who are just such an amazing company to work with, and we did some EX design work with them. I went down to their offices in Poole, beautiful offices, as you'd imagine, and they've got this great space in the middle of this floor. It's kind of a little bit, it's not really shut off, it's got a few screens, but it's not its open plan. And we ran the whole day in there, and we were like running a kind of an EX design sprint. And so the rest of the office could hear it, and people were sort of chipping in, and they were interested, they were coming and having a look, and they were getting involved, and it just works so well. It was really energizing, exciting, rather than being at the Nova Talent in London Bridge, where I used to do a lot of my training with the CIPD, which is very kind of a bland, not very exciting kind of place to learn. But I think it's really helpful, I think, to the way you've explained so beautifully the difference between you're not saying, what you're saying is that absolutely we need to make connections and be in person with people, just get really clear about the purpose of that. So I think that's really helpful, because I think there's a big debate at the moment about, do we get back into the office or not? And people need to be with people, and there's this whole debate about it, isn't there? So I think
what you're doing in the space that becomes really important. And if we're doing the wrong thing, if we're expecting people to sit down with a notebook and take a load of notes because you've got a sage on the stage, you just don't need that. TED Talks, 20 minutes of absolute pure injection of genius. Why aren't you curating those and saying, right, when we're going to do a new leadership program, here are 10 TED Talks, we're going to watch these before you come, and then come along and talk about what was your favorite, what spun out for you, what in your context makes the most sense, what inspired you, what didn't you like. That's just a much better use of time, because people there are making sense of what they're experiencing and seeing and learning and applying it to their work context. And I think that's where face-to-face has gone wrong in the past, where I call it injection education. You go along, you get your 5-day sessions, you get injections every day of knowledge, of information, and then you go back to your day job.
Forget it all.
Injections worn off. And
then you remember it back, you're like, oh, I remember that thing I learned on that course. It was, quite interesting. And I think something that really resonated with me, and I hadn't appreciated this, was how many similar themes there were with what you talk about in your book, and then what I've talked about in my first book, and then the book I wrote with Belinda. So, for example, aligning it with business strategy, starting with why, the empathy piece, the putting the end user, i.e. employees, at the center of the whole process, what's going to work for them. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And it kind of made me wonder if there is a need to shift the whole way we approach the people side of the business.
Definitely. Definitely. Come on, let's do it. Absolutely. I didn't know your work when I wrote my book, but then when we got to know each other and I was like, oh, this is just singing to me, because it is about people experience, all of it, your work, my work, organizational development work. It is all about, at heart, people. And when you consider, the awful treatments at the moment with P&O and how those people are being treated, and that's not a single incident, that sort of experience of hire and refire is going on around the country, which is quite shocking still. But when you consider, when we don't do something with heart, when we don't do something when we're people focused first, so from L&D's perspective, what do you need to learn and how can I help you learn it? What happens is the ramifications of that are huge. you know, the P&O, will anyone ever use their ferries again, ever? You know, the reputational damage. And then when you consider you know, organizations that have failed to really focus in on people, and they're leaving in drones. The great resignation is a thing, because people aren't recognizing that, you know, they've enjoyed being at home, they've got new puppies, they want to stay at home because of their new dogs. You know, so there's loads of knock-on effects if we don't get the people stuff right. And I definitely think that we need to be more people focused when it comes to L&D.
Absolutely. And I know, I mean, you mentioned before that kind of there's a course for that kind of approach, and we joke about it in our world. You know, there's an app for that. People want an app first, and you know, that it's definitely a big problem, I think, in our world. And I've thought long and hard about this, about how we can make it easy for practitioners to do the right thing. But often businesses, they just want a quick and easy fix. And you talk about, is it your sticking plasters? Yeah, I love that analogy. So tell us a bit about that.
So this is really where the book was born, in truth. That when I became a sole practitioner, I realized that over my time, as I mentioned, with LSG webinars and networking, I'd learned some stuff, and I thought, well, this might be useful to share. And so I started to tweet it out every day, one tweet a day, just with an idea that somebody could try, or a thought, because we need to move away from that sticking plasters approach, you know, where we just kind of, the course is the sticking plaster. It doesn't affect anything. Let's go back to Bob. Bob wants a course, we send him on a course, and then it's business as usual. When he goes back, nothing changes, no behavior shift, because no one's looking at embedding it. You know, there's no skills uplift, because no one really was checking out what skills he needed in the first place. And those sorts of activities that L&D get involved in, if you're being charged in your L&D department with how many courses have you put on, tick, you've done a really good job. Actually, what have you affected to the business? Nothing at all. But no one cares about that. So my approach is that if we can just shift away by trying some tiny things, what that helps us do is prove value. It helps us the next time somebody comes to us and says, you know, can you put Bob on a course? Yeah, well, tell me what you're trying to achieve here. You know, what is the problem that we're trying to solve by putting him on a course? Just that one question will then give you more insight in which to be able to, you know, offer something more valuable. It might be that mentoring is the way forward. It might be that, you know, going out with somebody who is really good at the job, to inspire, to motivate, to encourage, to learn from, might be the better option. And the better spend, it might be a coach. You know, there's lots of different solutions, but whilst we just stick a plaster over it with, you know, counting people sitting in a room, or counting spend, or you know, counting the wrong stuff, we're not really getting to the root of actually what we need to fix.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, again, for me, it just comes back to the point you make right at the beginning, which is that kind of start with your why. And we do, you know, a lot of work with clients where we spend quite a bit of time on that scoping space, because often they'll come to us and what they think they want is not actually what they need. And I know you've got a great chapter in the book on sort of stakeholder management, and, you know, I think that's really critical. And I mean, the people lab, we do, you know, quite a bit of kind of development work in our field around engagement and experience. And so often, you know, clients come to us and they'll want the moon on a stick, quite rightly. And then they'll say, but we can't take people away from the day job. We've got 60 minutes. And it's like, you know, and that negotiation of what you can really achieve in 60 minutes. And we kind of get there. We have some quite tough conversations, don't you, in our world? So
yes.
What have you got on that?
Yeah, so it is a lot of early doors understanding of what's the problem that you're trying to solve and how you prepare to solve it. So I try to make the analogy back to their real business. So if they are in the widget manufacturing industry, you know, we talk about, well, what's realistic for how many widgets you might manufacture in an hour, and we really can get down to a cost potentially. Okay, well, we take those people away for 1 hour, that's the cost to you. Are you prepared to invest that amount of money? You know, similarly, call center handlers, I think there's a case study in my book from a client I worked with who, you know, they've got people, they don't want to pull them off the phones. Okay, well, that's fine, but what's the cost of leaving them on the phones when they don't know what they're doing? You know, what's the impact to the customers? What's the reputational damage? And, you know, investigating all of those with your stakeholders, because what you're doing there is you're talking about a language that they understand. But all the while you're talking about people development, they've no interest. because that's not a language that they really are caring about or understanding. But if you can make a demonstration of, this is the consequence of doing nothing, this is the consequence of taking this action, and this is the consequence of sending them all on a 5-day program or whatever, they'll have a jolly fine time. There'll be a really tight-knit community when they get back, but it won't necessarily have shifted anything forward. So you really need to get under the skin of your business, I think.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And we talk about a lot. And again, sort of linking it back to the world of engagement and experience, it's always really shocking to me the amount of money that's invested in, the survey. So pre-app days, it'd be like the big kind of online survey. Now, a lot of money spent, software as a service model, it's per user, per month, per app. And yet no investment or little investment in helping managers to get good at this stuff, right? So it's like, well, we know that managers make the biggest difference to how we feel at work. So, and I have a real bugbear. I think managers get a lot of stick for, well, it's down to the managers, but no one's ever helped them to get good at engaging their people. If they don't, it's a horrible term anyway. It's like they don't know where to start. And there's very few managers that want to come to work and do a rubbish job. Most of them probably want to do this, but they haven't got a clue. So it's just shifting that mindset, which isn't always easy, is it? So I think it's some really good stuff in the book around how to practically take these ideas and apply them. So brings me on to one of the things I loved about the book. I love the fact that you've got the short read, the longer version. So you're really living practicing what you preach here, aren't you, in terms of different ways you can absorb the information, learn. So if you're in a hurry, you've got the short version, or the longer version, you've got your tweets, you've got your action points. So tell us a bit more about that and where all that came from and how that's helped people.
Something you said earlier actually resonated with me about, books. Do you just pick them up and put them down again because it's just so hard to read them? I'm not a natural reader. I am quite an impatient person. I'm married to a teacher, and I think 5 years taking somebody from year 7 to GCSEs, I'm like, God, 5 years, that's way too long. Being in girl guiding, I've learned patience, I have to say. But what I wanted to do was produce a book for busy people, people who are mums and carers and dog walkers and all this stuff outside of work, that gets in the way of thinking and gets in the way of how much time you might want to dedicate to your own professional development. So I've structured each chapter the same way. There is a short read. Technically, you could read the whole book in maybe an hour and a half, depending how slow you are at reading, and just get the gist of what I think about each of the topics. At the end of each chapter, there are things like the set list. So the idea behind that is, what mindset do you need in order to progress this? What skill set do you need? What tool set do you need to have? And data as well. What data set do you need? Just to start people thinking around some things that are perhaps not more as natural as they might be from an L&D perspective, and just giving them little snippets. So if you've read it and you want to come back to it, maybe you're going into a stakeholder meeting, you can just pick it up and just have a look through some of the thinking questions, in advance of your meeting, and just by way of being able to sort of pick up and put down. I mean, it is a handbook after all. It's not start at the beginning, finish it at the end. But what I'm finding interesting in the feedback is a lot of people say they're starting with the short reads and they're getting a flavour for it, and then they're feeling really like, I want to read more. And that's exactly what I was hoping for. So it's good to get that sort of feedback, people messaging on Twitter and LinkedIn and so on.
No, I loved it. I love the short reads. And like you said, I've done exactly that. I've kind of done the short reads and gone back in when I thought, I need a bit of that. So bringing me on to one of the chapters is about social learning, which I thought was just really fascinating. So talk to us about what you mean by social learning and how we can, and we've kind of hinted about it already, really. We talked a bit about it already, but how can we really use social learning at work?
For me, it's very simple. It's people learning from people. We've done it forever. We've done it before we had classroom. We've done it before we had books. We've done it forever. And so it's really getting back to what people are good at, which is learning from others. Now, you're born and you instantly start learning from everything around you. You have the curiosity of a child. You observe, you copy, you try, you fail, you go another way. And it's that really, for me, is all wrapped up in this sense of social learning. So creating spaces within work where that can happen, where it's absolutely acceptable to do that, is really important. And one of the chapters of the book I talk about environment, permission and culture, and it's wrapped up in this really, that people learning from people, great, how do we do that? We do that, for example, through more formal settings in Lunch and Learn. So you may have a whole programme, 12 Lunch and Learns once a month. Let's get together, bring our lunch and chat about it. And the L&D department can put those on. If you do that, will people learn? Will people come? Will people learn from each other? Will it be a social learning environment? Not necessarily. Because what you also need to wrap around that is how are we doing it? What environment are we doing that in? Are we physically having it? Are we having it hybrid? Are we having it through Zoom? You know, thinking carefully about that learning environment. If it's in Zoom, is it going to be sandwiched between people's meetings? Should we start it 10 minutes after the hour and finish it 10 minutes before the hour, so people have got time to nip to the loo or grab a coffee? Those sorts of levels of detail are really important to facilitate that social learning. Otherwise, what happens is people are too busy to come, they don't rock up, so on and so forth. Similarly, thinking about permission. In that permission, who's speaking, who's not speaking, how are we speaking, you know? So setting at the beginning, you know, we're going to do this in Zoom, pop your hand up if you've got a comment, we really want to hear from you. Anytime, pop something in the chat, anytime you like, you know, any questions that you've got, keep them coming. And, you know, maybe you want a producer who's feeding the questions to the speaker. There's lots of different things, but you just need to be really clear on that sort of structure and on what's allowed, what's not allowed. And it sounds really perverse because people have been doing social learning for years. So why can't people just talk to each other? But actually, people in a work setting, is it okay? You know, when you used to be in the office and you'd be having that coffee for just a little bit too long, you know, and be like, oh, where's Michelle gone? She's been ages. You know, but actually, I might have been learning about, you know, the finance strategy and or the latest research that's being done in a different department. This is all useful stuff. So for that to be okay, this is why you also need to address this whole cultural piece, how learning lands in your organisation. You know, social learning goes on whether you like it or not. It's whether you use it usefully and surface it that becomes key.
I think that's just a great example of one of the tools that I really love from the book. That's just really simple but really helpful. As you say, you know, outside of work, we kind of just crack on with social learning. We just make it happen and make it work. And you've got like moderators on you know, community groups on Facebook to make sure people behave, what have you, but kind of know the rules. But the minute you sort of step inside the workplace, suddenly that it feels different, right? And I remember, in fact, I talk about it in my first book years ago when I was working for an energy company. It was before social media, and I wish I'd recognized the value of what we had at the time, but I didn't. But basically, they set up this intranet, and they had like a kind of like, I suppose, a forum where you go on and just chat. And it was just like 2001, so it's like before social media.
Yeah, very radical.
Very radical. But what happened was when we kind of went through a merger, and I was looking after the comms team at the time, and there was one person whose full-time job it was to moderate this application, because people were putting all sorts of stuff on, you can imagine, right? And so we knew it had legs, so we kind of used the tool and we kind of rebranded it, and we absolutely looked at environment visual, though we didn't have the model at the time, but we looked at how we could use it so it's much more moderated. We had a kind of a, you know, a sort of we called it think tank. You know, a think tank, I think, like, you know, every couple of weeks, and with a purpose. We're going to think about, one think tank was about Nectar card. How can we use the Nectar card? You know, so it had a purpose to it. And if we were doing Nectar card, we got the right people behind the scenes to come on and answer questions. So we were able to use it effectively, and it worked brilliantly well. And like I say, I wish I'd realised what you had.
What you're talking about there is creating something psychologically safe. So you know, if you treat people like adults, they generally behave like adults, but they do need to understand purpose, like you say. So this is why I mentioned earlier, you know, you join the cycling club because your purpose is you want to get better at cycling, you're interested in cycling. And we'll naturally do this in our private lives, but in a work setting, we might need to sort of massage it a little bit. And then this becomes the role of L&D. And Andy Lancaster, who I've got a huge amount of respect and time for, he talks about a story where actually when let free rein, the most prolific group on a social network within a work setting was the vegan cookery group. Because they were all coming together. They weren't talking about vegan cookery particularly, they were just talking to each other, and I've got this challenge, and do you know how we can solve that? And you know, it's because you're creating networks within the work setting. They just so happen to have started out with their vegan cookery group connections. So this is why I think we need to, as L&D professionals, get a lot better at networking, a lot better at making connections, a lot better at, I call it the oil and the glue in the book, that we're there to stick people together and we're there to smooth the way. And this is a big shift for a lot of us, because I started out as a sage on the stage. You know, I was the person who was training in the room. I had the knowledge, I was imparting it to you, you know, but actually that isn't necessarily where we need to be. You find somebody with the knowledge, with the input, with the interest, and you as an L&D professional will help them share that in the best possible way so that social learning can take place. What we don't want is, you know, when you're at uni and that boring lectures that you possibly could have ever gone to. So we don't want that. We want to make sure that we're constantly engaged.
So who's doing this really well then? What companies can we look to that you think they've got this right? They're just way ahead. Who's doing it really well?
I think there's no answer to that question, because context is huge, right? Context really comes into play. So whilst I might be doing it, you know, really well in company Z, company Y have got a whole different context, so it wouldn't work. I think the people who are doing it well are the people who are actually trialing new stuff. So it might not be a finished article. So I recently, at the Learning Technologies Digital Days, heard Satnam Sagu speak from British Red Cross. And she is doing fantastic work. She's well deserving of her Colin Corder Award that she recently got from the RPI as Learning Professional of the Year. And a lot of what she's doing is taking a lot of things I put in my book about things like stakeholders and really engaging with the wider organisation, so that anything they put out in a learning context has come from a place which has got a solid foundation. They know it's going to work because they've done their research, a lot of evidence, you know, based approaches to things. So she's definitely worth looking up for, you know, how are they doing it there? But there's lots of little snippets of experiences, and there's every chapter in the book's got a case study, and that felt important to me. But after the case study, I posed sort of, you know, thoughts and questions, because a case study is rubbish unless you can apply it to your context. So it's really important that they're not just nice stories, and they can actually demotivate you, because you can think, oh wow, well of course they can do it because they've got loads of budget, or of course they can do it because they've got loads of resource. But actually you want to be able to say, well, what can I take from that and apply in my context? So there's lots of snippets of really good practice going on, but I'm not going to hold anybody particularly. I'm going to shout out Satnam because she did a really good job, but I'm also going to shout out, for example, World Vision UK. They're doing fantastic work on diversity and inclusion and listening exercises. They're listening really, really well to their teams, and you know, at a very senior level, listening to everybody in the teams. So, you know, that story's been told on Learning Now TV. So another area where you can go and get some good stories if you want to find out. But just, I think, you know, anyone who tries something new that they haven't tried before, they're doing it well, because it takes bravery. And if you're going to be brave enough to do that, you're doing it well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. So I'm mindful that we're getting towards the end of our time together. So what are the kind of, I don't know, your key top tips or your key golden nuggets you'd share with someone just starting out in this world? Like, you know, your absolute must-dos.
Find your people. So find yourself a tribe, if you want to use that word, or a network, if you want to use that word. Sometimes network's quite scary because it feels a little bit closed and we don't want to, you know, it feels a bit awkward to get into. But, you know, definitely recommend Twitter, recommend LinkedIn. Instagram is getting a lot more traction these days, I have to say, for the professional side of things. So that could be a good place to go. But find people who you can get inspiration from, who you can get ideas from, because if you are by yourself, or even if you're in an organisation which is perhaps, you know, got a large L&D team, but they just want to keep doing what they're doing, you need a cheer squad. That's the word I use in the book. You need a cheer squad to support you. And I would definitely say, if you're new to this, you know, come along. So things like L&D Co-work, which was a small group that I set up with Fiona McBride. We've now got co-work meetings all over the country. They're starting back to face-to-face. We had one just last week in Brighton. So coming along and working alongside other professionals for the day, or even just for an hour, you know, they're free and they're open to you. LD Insight, which is a hashtag that you could tweet on a Friday. So between 8 and 9 UK time on a Friday morning, that just goes out on Twitter. A question gets posed and people pile in, and, you know, just find people who are going to be there to support you and to remind you that you're not crazy if you want to move to a more modern approach in L&D. There are people out there trying to do this. Another good resource is check out the awards. So there's lots of different industry awards, the LPI's Learning Awards, or the CIPD's People Management Awards, and the Learning Technologies Awards, which I think are probably the best in the business. And see who the winners are and see what their stories are, and connect to them on LinkedIn, find out more from them, because you'll learn loads and you'll kind of miss the steps. What you don't want to do is start out in L&D, start with courses and, you know, an LMS and that, and work your way up. You know, just skip all that, just go straight to the end, be consultative, work with your stakeholders, get good learning experiences out there.
No, I love that. That's really, really good advice. I think some really good practical sort of tips there, and some great places for people to go and, like I say, meet their tribe. I call them PLUs, people like us. I need to find some PLUs.
It's good to find people not like you as well, actually, because that gives you sort of wider, broader experience. I actively seek out people that I disagree with, you know, in order to find out, well, why am I disagreeing with? Why are they rubbing up the wrong way? But then I do retreat to my personal learning network because it feels more comfortable.
Definitely. And just one last question before we finish. What next? So where does this world go? Where do you want to see it go next?
Well, I think that thanks to the pandemic, we have we've sped up the shift. One of the chapters in the book is evolution or revolution. Do we need to just chuck it all away and start again? And I think in real terms, no, we do need to evolve, but that evolution has absolutely sped up. So organizations that were steadfastly, you know, face-to-face is the only way to go, have realized that that can't be their only option anymore. And I'm really glad about that, because that's what my business does. Kairos Modern Learning supports people to move away from only offering face-to-face. And the reason I believe that that's so true is because you're never going to reach everybody with one way of doing something. And so offering the same information in multiple ways for learning is really the future, as far as I'm concerned. You know, it could be that one-stop resource, or it could be a book, it could be a library of books, it could be a video. There's loads of different ways that we can get stuff out to people. And I think we've got a lot to learn from our colleagues in marketing and PR, to be honest.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And on that point, we are in the process of developing, evolving our offer of the courses that we do. I mean, we've been running them online for quite a while, but we want to make them much more, I don't like the term blended learning. I don't know why, it doesn't work for me, but, you know, much more kind of multifaceted and you know, lots of different ideas for people in terms of how they can kind of, you know, move themselves forward. So definitely a good challenge for me to kind of take that next step. So thank you so much, Michelle. Really, really appreciate you making time to speak to us. We will obviously be sharing this reset show far and wide, and we'll make sure we share a link to your book as well, so people can get hold of that. So thank you, Michelle. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Yes, would love to. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Emma. I appreciate it. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.